The night my half-brother walked into my mother's restaurant and demanded half of everything she'd spent 30 years building, I told him no without flinching. 3 days later, he called me at 2 in the morning, laughing so hard he could barely get the words out. "We gutted your kitchen," he said. "The whole prep line. You're finished." I drove there in the dark with my hands shaking on the wheel, already grieving things I hadn't lost yet. But when I got there and saw what they'd destroyed, I didn't break down. I almost smiled. 'Cause the kitchen they tore apart wasn't my mother's kitchen. Not anymore. She had seen this coming long before I did, and she had moved everything that mattered long before she died. My mother built Sugar Mill from a 40-seat dining room on Magazine Street in New Orleans when I was 4 years old. She named it after the old cane processing plant that used to stand on that land, back when that part of the city smelled like molasses and river mud instead of coffee and tourists. She cooked everything herself in the beginning: red beans and rice on Mondays, slow-smoked brisket on Fridays, cornbread that people drove across 3 parishes to eat. By the time I was old enough to reach the prep counter without a step stool, we'd expanded into the space next door. By the time I finished culinary school, there were 3 locations and a waiting list for weekend reservations. She was the kind of woman who never raised her voice but somehow always got exactly what she needed. I watched her negotiate with vendors, manage temperamental line cooks, charm food critics, and keep the books tight, all without losing the warmth that made every person who walked through those doors feel like they were eating in someone's home. She taught me everything, not just the recipes but the reasoning behind them. Why you toast the roux until it smells like dark chocolate before you add anything else. Why the best gumbo takes more patience than skill. Why you never cut corners with people who've trusted you to feed them. She was diagnosed the spring I turned 31, pancreatic, the kind that moves fast. We had 8 months. I don't talk much about those 8 months. What I'll say is that she worked as long as she could. She'd come in on her good days and sit at the corner table by the kitchen pass-through, watching service with those dark, steady eyes, occasionally calling someone over to correct their knife technique or rearrange a plate presentation. Even toward the end, even when showing up cost her, she showed up. She wanted to make sure I could do it without her. She died on a Sunday morning in November. We closed all 3 restaurants for 3 days. Her head chef, Nissa, who had been standing next to my mother in commercial kitchens for 15 years, held everything together while I fell apart. I don't know what I would have done without Nissa in those first weeks. She kept the lights on when grief made everything else feel impossible. The legal transition was clean because my mother had made it clean. She'd been preparing for it with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. I became majority owner through her estate. I knew what I was taking on. I also knew I was exactly where she wanted me to be. What I didn't know was that someone had been watching all of this from a distance, and that when she died, he decided it was time to walk through the door. My half-brother showed up 6 weeks after the funeral. I had known he existed for about 4 years. My mother had told me herself, quietly, one evening when we were closing down the Uptown location together. She said she'd had a son before she met my father, that the relationship had ended badly, and that she'd lost contact with the boy when he was very young. She'd tried to find him twice, she said. Come up empty both times. She looked out the window when she said it, the way she looked at things she'd already made her peace with. I didn't know he had found her, not until she was gone. He appeared at the soft opening of our new Bywater location, a Tuesday night event I'd been planning for months, a night meant to celebrate expanding to a 4th location. I'd invited regulars, local press, a few old friends of my mother's. The room smelled like fresh paint and braised short rib. Everything was going exactly as I'd hoped. Then the door opened and a man I recognized from a single photograph walked in like he already owned the place. He was taller than I expected, wearing an expensive jacket that looked slightly wrong for the room, like someone who'd dressed for a different kind of occasion. He had my mother's jawline. I noticed that immediately, and something uncomfortable moved through me because of it. He came straight toward me without looking at anyone else. He said my name like a statement. Behind him was a man in a suit who identified himself as a legal consultant, though he never produced a card. My half-brother said he had documentation, said our mother had made verbal assurances to him regarding the business, said she had promised him a share, recognition for being the older child, for being kept away from a family he had a right to know. He said he wanted 30% of Sugar Mill. He said all of this at a corner table, while the soft opening continued around us, and my mother's employees moved through the room with trays of food she had helped me plan before she got too sick to come to tastings. I sat across from him with my hands flat on the tablecloth, and I felt something cold and deliberate settle into my chest. I told him no. I told him the will was clear and the estate was in order, and he had no legal claim to anything she had built. I told him if he believed otherwise, he was welcome to pursue it through proper channels. I told him to please enjoy the food and leave. He didn't finish the meal. His consultant picked up his briefcase. My half-brother looked at me for a long moment before standing, and there was something in his face I couldn't quite read. Not rage. Something more calculated than that. Like he was adjusting a plan, not abandoning one. "You'll regret this," he said, and walked out. The rest of the evening went smoothly, but I drove home that night with his face in my mind and the way he'd looked at the dining room, not like someone who wanted to belong there, but like someone measuring it for something else entirely. I went to my mother's house on Wednesday. I'd been going there more than I probably should have, still half expecting to find her in the kitchen or the back garden where she grew her herbs. The house held that particular quiet that comes after someone has been very present in a space for a long time and then suddenly isn't. I walked through to her office, not entirely sure what I was looking for. On the shelf above her desk, tucked behind a row of cookbook spines, was a recipe journal I didn't recognize. Dark green cloth cover, my name written inside in her handwriting. Beneath my name, she had written, "For when someone starts circling." My throat closed. I sat down on the floor right there and read every page. The journal wasn't only recipes, it was something between a letter and an archive. She wrote about noticing, about 14 months before she died, that her former business partner had begun reaching out to people connected to Sugar Mill, old vendors, former employees, two of her longtime regulars who she suspected had connections to restaurant investment circles. She wrote about it the way she wrote about a dish that wasn't quite coming together. Methodical, curious, unhurried. His name was Severin Dace. He had been a minor co-investor in the original Magazine Street location, someone my mother had bought out years ago after discovering he was padding invoices and skimming from delivery accounts. She hadn't pressed charges. She'd simply removed him and moved on. He had signed the buyout without argument, which she noted at the time had struck her as too easy. She'd been right. Tucked into the back cover of the journal was a small envelope containing a USB drive and a key I didn't immediately recognize. I opened the drive at her kitchen table. What I found made me sit very still for a long time. There were photographs. Severin with my half-brother at a restaurant in Metairie, a second meeting outside a law office in the warehouse district. The timestamps placed these meetings in the weeks immediately following my mother's diagnosis, before she had told anyone outside our immediate family, which meant someone had been close enough, or had a source close enough, to know. There were email chains. Severin and my half-brother discussing the restaurant's estimated valuation, the expected timeline of estate proceedings, the vulnerabilities of a contested will. There was a legal strategy document about leveraging a claim of verbal promise and mental incapacity. Mental incapacity. One more file. An audio recording, 8 minutes long. Severin's voice, speaking to someone I didn't recognize, outlining a plan to build a documented record of cognitive decline during my mother's treatment, to create evidence that she had not been of sound mind when she finalized her estate. My mother, who ran 3 restaurant locations through chemotherapy, who corrected a line cook's roux technique 3 weeks before she died, who had clearly seen every piece of this coming and spent her last healthy months building a counter-archive while she was fighting for her life. I didn't sleep that night. At 2:14 in the morning, my phone lit up. My half-brother's number, I answered. He was laughing, loud and certain. "We gutted your kitchen," he said. "The whole prep line. Cold storage, too. Health inspector's going to have a field day when they see it. You're done." There was noise behind him. Voices, the sound of something being knocked over. I was in my car in 4 minutes. I drove toward the address I assumed he meant. The original Magazine Street location. The flagship. The one my mother had opened when I was barely old enough to form memories. I drove through empty streets, thinking about everything she had poured into that place, and I felt it shaking inside me like something I was about to lose. When I turned onto the block, there were no emergency vehicles, no crowds. The lights inside the old space were on, and through the front window I could see the interior had been torn through. Equipment overturned, shelving pulled from walls, the walk-in standing open. But then I slowed down. The sign above the door wasn't right. It wasn't the sugar mill sign. It was a temporary vacancy placard, the kind a landlord puts on a commercial space between tenants. And the door, I knew that door. I'd walked through it hundreds of times. I knew where the handle used to stick on humid mornings, where the threshold had a shallow groove from years of foot traffic. This wasn't the same door. The windows were a different proportion. The tile near the entrance was wrong. This wasn't my mother's kitchen. She had relocated the Magazine Street operation 5 weeks before she died, quietly, without any announcement, to a larger space 6 blocks east that she had been negotiating for over a year. She hadn't told the press. She'd told almost no one. The new location was in soft prep for a spring opening. The old space had been returned to the landlord for a renovation project. They had destroyed a vacant commercial kitchen they had no connection to, a stranger's property. My phone buzzed, a video from my half-brother. He'd filmed himself inside the ruined space, talking directly into the camera, holding something up like a trophy. He said my name. He said I was finished. He said my mother's legacy ended tonight. The video was 8 minutes long and he was in frame the entire time. I sat in my car for a while. Then I drove to the right address. The new location was untouched, dark and quiet, the walk-in humming steadily, prep surfaces gleaming under the safety lights. 30 years of my mother's work was intact, moved and secured and protected by someone who had understood exactly what was at risk long before I did. She had known. She had moved everything, and in doing so, she had handed me something I hadn't understood I was holding. 8 minutes of self-documented evidence of exactly who these people were and what they had been willing to do. I called my attorney at 6 in the morning. I called the police at 6:15. Nessa was at the new kitchen by 7. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she crossed to the reach-in near the back wall and took out a thick envelope that my mother had given her to keep. Inside was a handwritten letter, and beneath it a second flash drive. My mother appeared on the screen. She was thin by that point, the way illness makes people thin, but her eyes were sharp and her voice was measured and deliberate. She spoke for 11 minutes. She addressed the will directly, confirmed she had been of entirely sound mind during its drafting and execution, named the dates of her 2 independent mental competency evaluations. She named Severin. She explained, calmly and with precision, how she had discovered his communications with my half-brother, and what she believed his real goal was, not a share of the business, but a destabilized estate he could leverage into a buyout at crisis pricing. She said she had encountered his approach once before, and she recognized its shape. She looked into the camera at the very end and said, "If you're watching this, it means I was right. I'm sorry I couldn't have warned you more directly. But I needed you to see it yourself so you'd believe it completely." I had to step outside after that. I stood in the alley behind the kitchen for a long time. The will reading took place at my mother's attorney's office 10 days later. My half-brother arrived with a woman who carried a recording device and introduced herself as a journalist working on a piece about family business succession. He was dressed formally. He had the bearing of someone who had practiced what winning felt like in a mirror. He presented a notarized statement claiming verbal agreement to a 30% ownership stake. My mother's attorney examined it for approximately 90 seconds before placing it face down on the desk. The formatting was inconsistent with my mother's estate documents. The notary stamp was registered in a parish she had never done business in. Her signature was close, but not close enough for someone who had reviewed her signature on hundreds of documents over 2 decades. Some of my half-brother's certainty began to drain from his face. Before he could speak, my attorney opened a laptop and played the video from the night of the vandalism. My half-brother in the ruined kitchen talking to the camera, naming himself, naming me, describing exactly what he'd done and why. 8 minutes of it, unedited and clear. 2 officers entered the room. My half-brother turned toward the journalist as though she might be a lifeline. She turned off her recording device and took a small, careful step back. Then my mother's video played. The room held completely still through all 11 minutes. When her voice faded out, nobody spoke. My half-brother sat with his hands on the table, staring at the screen where her face had been. I don't know what he was thinking in that moment. I don't suppose I ever will. The officers had a warrant connected to the destruction of commercial property belonging to a third party. They had a second document pending on charges related to Severin Dace, who had been taken into federal custody 2 days earlier. On fraud charges tied to a supplier manipulation scheme he had been running through 3 shell companies for years. Sugar Mill had been his planned final move, a way out before investigators closed in. My half-brother had been a useful entry point. He had been offered a cut he was never going to receive. My half-brother didn't look at me when they walked him out. He agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in the weeks that followed, in exchange for reduced charges. He told them that Severin had come to him with knowledge of our family connection, had presented the arrangement as both profitable and righteous. Justice for a son who had been kept from his mother. He had been recruited and managed the same way Severin managed everyone. Find someone with a real grievance, then point it in a useful direction. I held a staff meeting at the new location before I spoke to anyone else. The people who had worked alongside my mother for years deserved to hear it first. Then I spoke to the press. I showed them the documentation. I played my mother's video one more time, because I thought she deserved to be heard by more than just a conference room, and because I thought the people who had given years to what she built deserved to see that she had never stopped thinking about them, right to the very end. In the spring, we launched a culinary apprenticeship for young people from the neighborhoods that had surrounded my mother's restaurants for 3 decades. Kids who wanted to cook but had no pathway into professional kitchens. Nessa runs the program. We named it after the old cane field, the same history my mother had honored when she chose that name all those years ago. I found one final note in the recipe journal 2 months later, pressed flat between the page on braised chicken and the page on slow-cooked greens. I'd missed it entirely the first time. She hadn't written it on a separate piece of paper. She'd written it in tiny, neat lines directly in the margin, beside a bread pudding recipe she'd adapted from her own grandmother's version. Just tucked it there, in her careful hand, like a note to herself that she'd decided to leave for me instead. These recipes aren't what I'm leaving you. You already know how to cook. What I'm leaving you is the restaurant, and the restaurant is just a room. The real thing is what you do when someone tries to take it from you. You already know how to do that too. I made sure. The Sunday morning ritual is mine now. I go in early before the prep crew arrives and I make the cornbread myself from the recipe on page 1 of her journal. It's the first thing she ever taught me, and the one thing I've never delegated to anyone else. The recipe is simple. The note she added at the bottom, in different ink, added later than the rest. Make it with love or don't make it at all. I try to honor that every time I'm in that kitchen, in the room she built and moved and protected, in the place that is still, and will stay, exactly what she always meant it to be.